Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of Pennsylvania. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. In the autumn of 1903, the coal mining town of Ridgemont, nestled deep within the Allegheny Mountains of Pennsylvania, harbored a secret that would remain buried for nearly 8 decades. The Harrison family homestead, a sprawling two-story structure of weathered timber and stone, sat isolated on 43 acres of densely forested land approximately 7 miles northeast of the main settlement. According to municipal records preserved in the Somerset County Courthouse, the property had been in the Harrison name since 1879, purchased by Patriarch Edward Harrison following his return from the Indian Wars. What makes this case particularly disturbing is not what was reported to authorities at the time, but rather what was deliberately omitted from all official documentation. The first indication that something was fundamentally wrong came from an unexpected source, a routine tax assessment conducted by County Clerk Thomas Mitchell in October 1903. Mitchell's handwritten notes, discovered in 1974 during a courthouse renovation, contain a marginal annotation that reads, "Family claims 3 residents, but observed evidence suggests otherwise. Recommend further investigation. Something is not right about the accounting." This cryptic notation would prove to be the only official acknowledgement of irregularities at the Harrison homestead for the next 77 years. The Harrison family, as they presented themselves to the scattered community of Ridgemont, consisted of Edward, age 54, a former cavalry officer turned gentleman farmer, his wife Margaret, 47, described by neighbors as a woman of unusual intelligence and unsettling composure, and their 2 adult offspring, William, 26, who assisted his father with the property's limited agricultural operations, and Elizabeth, 23, who rarely left the family grounds. Contemporary accounts from local residents paint a picture of a family that maintained strict boundaries between themselves and their neighbors. Sarah Henderson, who operated a small trading post 3 miles south of the Harrison property, provided one of the few detailed observations of the family dynamic in her personal correspondence with a sister in Philadelphia. In a letter dated September 1903, preserved in the Pennsylvania Historical Society archives, she wrote, "The Harrison family keeps to themselves in a manner that strikes one as deliberate rather than natural. When they do venture into town for supplies, they move as a unit, speaking little and watching much. There is an intensity to their silence that makes conversation impossible." The physical isolation of the Harrison homestead contributed significantly to the family's ability to maintain their privacy. The nearest neighbor lived over 2 miles away, separated by dense woodland and treacherous mountain terrain. The single road leading to the property was little more than a dirt track that became impassable during heavy rains, effectively cutting the family off from the outside world for days or weeks at a time. Dr. Robert Williams, the traveling physician who served the scattered communities of eastern Somerset County, left detailed notes about his occasional visits to treat members of the Harrison family. His medical journal, donated to the Pennsylvania Medical Association archives in 1935, contains entries spanning from 1900 to 1903 that provide rare insights into the family's internal dynamics. In an entry dated March 1902, Dr. Williams wrote, "Called to attend Elizabeth Harrison for persistent headaches and what her father describes as nervous episodes. Found the young woman to be articulate and rational, though possessed of an unusual intensity when discussing family matters. Most peculiar was her insistence that I examine only her symptoms, refusing any inquiry into their duration or possible causes. The family maintains an atmosphere of polite, but absolute control over all interactions with outsiders." According to testimony given years later by a drifter named Jacob Miller, who briefly worked for the family harvesting timber in the summer of 1903, The household operated according to strict schedules that seemed designed to limit contact between family members and any outside observer. Miller told investigators that he was permitted to work only in specific areas of the property, was forbidden from entering the house under any circumstances, and was required to begin and end his workday at precisely designated times. What made Miller's testimony particularly valuable was his description of sounds he heard emanating from the house during his brief employment. In a sworn statement given to Somerset County Sheriff Daniel Parker in 1904, Miller described, "Regular as clockwork. Every morning around 5, you'd hear this low humming coming from the house. It wasn't singing exactly, but more like someone trying to keep themselves calm through repetition. It would go on for maybe 20 minutes, then stop suddenly. Then you'd hear footsteps moving through the house in a particular pattern, room to room, always in the same order. It felt like listening to some kind of ritual." The Harrison family's relationship with the broader community of Ridgemont was characterized by careful maintenance of appearances, coupled with systematic avoidance of meaningful social contact. They attended Sunday services at the local Methodist church with remarkable consistency, arriving punctually and departing immediately after the final hymn. Reverend Samuel Wright noted in his pastoral records that the family occupied the same pew every week, positioned near the back of the small church where they could observe other congregants while remaining relatively unobserved themselves. The year 1903 brought subtle changes to the Harrison family dynamic that were noticed only in retrospect. Sarah Henderson noted in her correspondence that the family's trips to town became less frequent and more hurried. Dr. Williams recorded that his services were requested more often, though all were for vague ailments that seemed to require his presence more than his medical expertise. The trigger for what would become known as the Harrison Affair occurred on November 3, 1903, though its true significance would not be recognized for decades. On that date, a traveling photographer named Charles Anderson arrived in Ridgemont as part of his documentation of rural Pennsylvania communities for a Philadelphia newspaper. According to Anderson's detailed journal preserved in the Pennsylvania Press Association archives, he approached the Harrison property with casual confidence. Upon explaining his mission to document local families, he was invited to speak with Edward Harrison. Anderson wrote, "When I mentioned my desire to capture a family portrait, his composure changed entirely. He began asking specific questions about my equipment, my process for developing plates, and most strangely, what happened to the photographic plates after publication." After nearly 30 minutes of family consultation, Edward Harrison returned to inform Anderson that they would not be participating in his photographic project. However, the manner of this refusal struck the photographer as particularly odd. Rather than offering typical explanations, Edward insisted on detailed assurances about Anderson's departure from the area and his commitment to excluding any mention of the Harrison family from his newspaper articles. This encounter took on more sinister implications when Anderson attempted to develop the photographic plates 3 days later. The photographer's journal entry for November 6, 1903, describes his confusion. "The plates containing images of the Harrison property have developed with peculiar distortions that affect only the portions showing their buildings. The landscape elements appear normal, but structures are rendered with an odd doubling effect. Most perplexing is that these distortions appear only on plates exposed within sight of their property." Community response to these subtle alterations in Harrison family behavior followed predictable patterns. Increased observation coupled with reluctance to interfere directly in private family matters. Sheriff Daniel Parker later testified that he received no formal complaints about the Harrison family during the winter months of 1903 to 1904. However, his personal notes revealed that several residents had approached him informally to express unspecified concerns. Winter isolation traditionally strengthened family bonds in Allegheny communities. For the Harrison family, winter isolation served a fundamentally different purpose. Evidence suggests that the family used the natural barriers imposed by weather and geography to implement increasingly rigid controls over every aspect of daily life within their household. Dr. Williams recorded one visit to the Harrison homestead during the winter months, prompted by an emergency call received in February 1904. His medical journal describes a journey undertaken in treacherous conditions. The doctor wrote, "Arrived at the Harrison homestead after considerable difficulty. Found the family assembled in their main parlor, maintained at an uncomfortably warm temperature. All 4 family members appeared healthy and uninjured, contradicting the urgency of the summons. When I inquired about the patient requiring treatment, Margaret informed me that the situation had improved during the time required for my travel." Spring came early to the mountains of Pennsylvania in 1904. The return of accessibility brought the first systematic opportunity for neighbors to assess what had occurred at the Harrison homestead during the winter months of isolation. Their return to Sunday church services in March revealed immediate differences. Reverend Wright noted in his pastoral records that the family appeared to have developed an even more pronounced tendency toward isolation. Several parishioners later reported that Margaret Harrison appeared to have aged considerably during the winter, while Edward demonstrated increased nervousness. Dr. Williams received several requests for house calls during the spring months of 1904, all initiated by family members claiming various ailments. His medical journal records growing frustration with these visits. The physician wrote, "Have now attended the Harrison family on 7 occasions since March. All were summoned for symptoms that proved either completely resolved upon my arrival or too vague to permit effective treatment. The pattern suggests deliberate manipulation of my professional obligations." The spring months of 1904 also brought the return of Jacob Miller, who had been hired to resume seasonal work on the Harrison property. His observations of changes in the physical landscape provided additional evidence that the winter months had been used for activities beyond normal household maintenance. Miller later testified that several alterations to the property were immediately apparent. The covered walkway connecting the main house to the additional wing had been enclosed with wooden panels. New locks had been installed on several outbuilding doors, and windows in the main house had been covered with heavy curtains that remained closed throughout the day. The events that would ultimately expose the true nature of the Harrison family situation began with what appeared to be a routine occurrence: the arrival of County Tax Assessor Thomas Mitchell for his annual property evaluation in late April 1904. The most significant discrepancy involved the family's reported household composition. Tax records from previous years consistently listed 4 residents. However, Mitchell's observations during his 1904 visit suggested the possibility of additional persons living on the property who were not being officially acknowledged. The tax assessor noted evidence of food consumption patterns that seemed excessive for 4 adults, including large quantities of preserved goods. This recommendation triggered the first official investigation of the Harrison family situation. Sheriff Parker was requested to accompany Mitchell on a follow-up visit to verify household composition. The joint visit, conducted in early May 1904, represented the first time that law enforcement had entered the Harrison homestead with official authority to investigate irregularities. Sheriff Parker's official report described a family that appeared cooperative but nervous. All 4 acknowledged family members were present and accounted for. However, the sheriff noted several indicators that suggested incomplete disclosure. The law enforcement officer wrote, "Family produces required documentation without delay, but physical evidence suggests household routines designed to accommodate more persons than are officially acknowledged." When questioned about these discrepancies, Edward attributes them to occasional visiting relatives. The official investigation concluded with updated tax assessments, but no criminal charges were filed. However, the investigation had an unexpected consequence. It altered the psychological equilibrium that the Harrison family had maintained through careful control of outside contacts. Sarah Henderson wrote to her sister in May 1904, "Since the sheriff's visit, there's been a marked change in the sounds and patterns of activity at the Harrison place. The regularity we'd grown accustomed to has been replaced by something altogether more erratic." Early summer of 1904 brought the most intensive period of activity at the Harrison homestead. Neighbors reported almost constant sounds of construction, renovation, or rearrangement work being conducted both during daylight hours and continuing well into the night. Jacob Miller reported being assigned increasingly specific and limited tasks that prevented him from observing the full scope of work. This abrupt termination of his employment eliminated the family's last regular contact with outside workers and completed their isolation from community oversight. The autumn of 1904 brought the first direct evidence that the Harrison family's living arrangements included persons who were not participating voluntarily. This evidence emerged through an unexpected source, a routine mail delivery. Postal carrier Henry Thompson later testified that he had been delivering mail to the Harrison homestead addressed to names that did not match the 4 family members. When he inquired about these deliveries, Edward consistently claimed that the mail was intended for visiting relatives. The postal investigation represented the first systematic examination of the Harrison family's activities. Inspector William Foster wrote, "The family provides explanations for mail irregularities that are technically consistent with legal postal usage, though patterns suggest possible systematic misrepresentation of household composition." The winter of 1904 to 1905 marked the final phase of the Harrison family's ability to maintain their concealed arrangements. Neighbors reported that sounds from the property differed dramatically from previous years. Sarah Henderson wrote, "What we hear from the Harrison place now bears little resemblance to normal household activity. There are sounds of running, door slamming, and what can only be described as struggle occurring within their home during nighttime hours." The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a fire that broke out in one of their outbuildings during a February 1905 snowstorm. The fire required assistance from neighbors, providing the first opportunity in over 6 months for outside parties to gain access to areas carefully concealed from observation. Volunteer firefighters discovered evidence that the building had been modified to serve as living quarters for persons being kept under conditions that clearly violated their freedom. The structural modifications included barred windows, reinforced doors with exterior locks, and interior arrangements that suggested involuntary confinement. Fire Chief Michael Davis wrote in his official report, "Firefighting efforts revealed building modifications and personal effects, suggesting use as involuntary housing for persons not acknowledged as legitimate residents. Evidence indicates systematic concealment of individuals who may be held under conditions of unlawful restraint." The subsequent investigation conducted jointly by county sheriff's deputies and federal postal inspectors revealed a complex system of involuntary servitude and identity fraud that had been operating for over 3 years. Multiple individuals were discovered living on the property under conditions of systematic coercion, forced to assume false identities, and participate in financial fraud schemes while being denied freedom of movement. Sheriff Parker's final report documented, "Investigation reveals a systematic operation involving kidnapping, identity fraud, and forced labor extending over multiple years and affecting at least 7 individuals." The trial of the Harrison family members conducted in Somerset County Circuit Court during the summer of 1905 revealed additional details about their methods. Testimony from victims described systematic techniques of psychological control that resembled military prisoner interrogation methods. The presiding judge, Honorable Marcus Caldwell, wrote in his sentencing remarks, The court finds that the defendants operated a criminal enterprise of unusual sophistication and cruelty, employing psychological manipulation techniques that reduced their victims to conditions of complete dependence. Edward and Margaret Harrison were sentenced to life imprisonment, while William and Elizabeth received terms of 25 years, each based on evidence that their participation had been partially coerced by their parents. The Harrison homestead was seized by county authorities and remained vacant for several years before being sold at public auction. Professor James Ashworth's academic study of the case, published by Pennsylvania State University Press in 1977, concluded that the Harrison family operation represented one of the earliest documented examples of systematic psychological warfare being used for criminal purposes in American history. The professor wrote, "The Harrison case demonstrates that human psychology can be systematically manipulated through techniques of isolation, identity destruction, and reality distortion that render victims incapable of normal resistance." The long-term fate of the Harrison family members varied significantly. Edward died in prison in 1913, reportedly suffering from paranoid delusions. Margaret survived until 1930, maintaining her innocence. William was released in 1930 after serving his full sentence and reportedly moved to California. Elizabeth died in prison in 1921. The victims faced varying degrees of success in rebuilding their lives. Several never fully recovered and required lifelong institutional care. One victim provided written testimony that became crucial for understanding their methods. The witness wrote, "They did not simply imprison us physically, but systematically destroyed our understanding of who we were and what was real. Through constant manipulation of information, social isolation, and punishment for independent thought, they created conditions where resistance became psychologically impossible." The lasting significance of the Harrison case lies in its demonstration that human psychology can be systematically manipulated for criminal purposes. Recognition of these techniques contributed to the development of modern approaches to preventing, detecting, and treating psychological crimes that continue to influence criminal justice practice today. The story serves as a reminder that criminal activity can be concealed behind facades of normalcy for extended periods. The case demonstrates the importance of community vigilance and persistent investigation. Perhaps most significantly, the Harrison case illustrates the resilience of human psychology under extreme conditions and the possibility of recovery, even from systematic psychological manipulation. The historical record of the Harrison case remains available for study at Pennsylvania State University, the Somerset County Historical Society, and the Pennsylvania State Archives. These materials continue to provide valuable insights for researchers studying criminal psychology, law enforcement history, and the development of modern understanding of psychological manipulation and trauma.